The call came like a crack of thunder on a clear day, shattering the sterile calm of my laboratory. My father, Jacob Reed, a man as unyielding as the granite bedrock of our land, had met with an accident. The words were clinical, detached, a harvester malfunction, severe trauma, but they conjured images of blood and broken bones that my scientific mind couldn't rationalize away. So I drove. I left the city of logic and reason, the life I had built on a foundation of measurable data, and pointed my car towards the one place I swore I'd never return, my family's farm, an isolated, impossibly green oasis I had long since escaped. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The demarcation line was jarring. One moment, I was driving through the familiar, sun-bleached landscape of the rural Midwest, a patchwork of dusty browns and tired greens where struggling farms clung to life against the whims of a relentless drought. The next, I crossed an unseen threshold onto reed land. The change was so abrupt it felt like a hallucination. The air grew thick, humid, and heavy with the scent of chlorophyll and damp earth. On either side of the gravel road, fields of corn stood impossibly tall, their stalks thick as my wrist, their leaves a shade of emerald so deep it was almost black. Neighboring properties had corn that was waist-high and yellowing. Ours looked like a primeval jungle. It was wrong. It was a defiant, arrogant green middle finger to the natural order, and it made the hairs on my arm stand on end. I'd spent 8 years trying to forget this place, trading the superstitions of the farm for the certainties of science. As Dr. Evelyn Reed, soil botanist, I understood nutrient cycles, nitrogen fixation, and hydration. I could explain why the surrounding farms were failing. The soil was tired, the rain scarce. I had no logical explanation for what I was seeing. My father had always called it the blessing of the land. He'd speak the words with a grim reverence that bordered on fear, his eyes fixed on the oldest field, the one we called the marrow. To me, it was always just fanaticism, the folk talk of uneducated farmers who saw divine will in a good harvest and damnation in a blight. I had dismissed it, scorned it, and fled from it. Now, seeing this impossible vitality, a cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. The disdain I once felt was curdling into a primal unease. The old farmhouse stood where it always had, a 2-story sentinel of weathered white wood, its porch swing gently swaying in a breeze that didn't seem to exist. It looked the same, but it felt different. The oppressive silence I remembered was now a humming, vibrant quiet, the sound of life growing with an unnatural fervor. I found my father in his bedroom, a broken man lost in a sea of white sheets. The town doctor had already been and gone, leaving a grim prognosis and a bottle of potent painkillers. Jacob was a statue of bandages and bruises, his leg grotesquely twisted and encased in a cast, his breathing a shallow, pained rasp. His eyes, usually so sharp and commanding, were clouded with the feverish delirium. He was a mountain eroded to a hill, and the sight of him stole the breath from my lungs. After a few one-sided, whispered assurances that I was there and would handle things, I escaped the stifling air of the sick room. I needed answers. I needed something logical to hold on to. My feet carried me towards the site of the accident near the edge of the Morrow field. The harvester stood there, a hulking beast of red metal, silent and still. A dark, rust-colored stain marred the blades of the thresher, a stark confirmation of the violence that had occurred. But as I examined the machine, my unease deepened. The official story was a malfunction, a slip. But the safety override was engaged, and the gearing mechanism showed no signs of stripping. It was the positioning that was wrong. The damage, the direction of the blood spray, it was all wrong. It looked less like he had slipped and fallen into the machine, and more like the machine had lunged, pulling him not away from the field, but towards it. My gaze fell upon the earth beside the harvester, A patch of soil, perhaps 10 feet in diameter, was a profound, lightless black, the color of wet coal. It looked rich, impossibly fertile, but there was something more. Kneeling, I hesitated before reaching out. My scientific curiosity warred with a gut-deep instinct to recoil. I pressed my palm against it. It was warm. Not just sun-warmed, but retaining a deep, persistent heat, as if a low-grade furnace was burning just beneath the surface. I pulled my hand back, rubbing my fingers together. The warmth was strange, but I tried to rationalize it. The engine, I told myself. The harvester's engine must have heated the ground. But the engine had been cold for over a day. A faint, cloying smell like rich compost and something vaguely metallic clung to the air around the patch. I stood up, my mind racing. The impossible green of the farm, the strange nature of my father's accident, this bizarrely warm black soil. It was a triangle of anomalies, a puzzle my logic couldn't assemble. From the corner of my eye, I saw a flicker of movement. A cornstalk, one of the behemoths at the edge of the marrow field, swayed, its broad leaves rustling. But there was no wind. It seemed to bend slightly, turning its head like a sunflower, except it wasn't tracking the sun. It was tracking me. I blinked, shaking my head. Stress. Grief. That's all this is. But as I turned and walked back towards the house, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not by a person, but by the land itself. The vibrant, unnatural green of the Reed family farm no longer felt like a blessing. It felt like a cage, and I had just willingly walked back inside. The silence of the fields pressed in, and for the first time in years, I felt the cold, familiar touch of fear. The old ways I scoffed at were no longer distant superstitions. They were a living, breathing presence, and their roots were wrapped tight around the foundations of my home. The first few days were a blur of grim routine. I played the role of nurse to my broken father and, by necessity, became the reluctant farmer. With no hired hands, our farm had always been a fiercely private, family-only operation. The burden of the immediate tasks fell to me. The most pressing of these was tending to the marrow field. It was the heart of the farm, the source of its unnatural bounty, and despite my fear, it needed to be worked. Putting on my father's worn leather boots, I felt like an imposter in his world, a scientist masquerading as a farmer. The moment I stepped onto the black soil of the marrow, the world shifted. The feeling underfoot was indescribably wrong. It wasn't the firm, gritty texture of normal earth. It was yielding, spongy, like walking on a dense, living membrane. With each step, it seemed to depress and then slowly rebound, as if I were treading on something that breathed. I tried to dismiss it as a high concentration of peat or some other organic matter, a scientific explanation that felt hollow and inadequate the moments I formed it. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for the sighing of the wind through the corn. But the air was unnervingly still. This was a different sound, a low, wet, aspirating noise that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. A soft, continuous whisper, just on the edge of hearing. I stopped, tilting my head, trying to pinpoint the source, but it was everywhere and nowhere at once, a chorus of sighs rising from the very dirt I stood upon. Through the thick soles of my boots, a new sensation began, a vibration. It wasn't the tremor of machinery or any seismic activity. It was a slow, rhythmic pulse, like a massive, sluggish heartbeat. Thump-thump, thump-thump. The rhythm was hypnotic and deeply unsettling. It was the pulse of a living thing, and I was standing on its skin. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get off this patch of sentient earth. But the corn needed tending, and the image of my father, helpless in his bed, chained me to my duty. I worked with frantic, jerky movements, my body drenched in a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the day's heat. The whispers seemed to follow me, rising and falling in cadence with the rhythmic thrumming from below. That evening, I was by my father's bedside, changing his dressing.
His fever was high, his body slick with sweat. He tossed and turned, muttering incomprehensible fragments. Suddenly, his eye snapped open, a flicker of raw, lucid terror cut through the delirium. He grabbed my wrists, his grip surprisingly strong, his fingers digging into my skin like claws. He tried to speak, but only a choked gurgle came out. Panic contorted his features. He gestured wildly with his free hand towards a notepad and pen on the nightstand. I quickly handed it to him. His hand, shaking violently, scrawled a few frantic, almost illegible words. The letters were jagged, desperate slashes of ink. He pushed the pad into my hands, his eyes boring into mine, and then, as if the effort had broken him, he collapsed back onto the pillow, lapsing into unconsciousness. I looked down at the notepad. The message was 4 words, underlined so fiercely the pen had torn the paper. Don't starve the marrow. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken horror. Starve it? How do you starve soil? The message was a piece of the puzzle I didn't want, a confirmation of the madness I was trying so hard to deny. It wasn't superstition, it was a warning, a desperate, terrified warning. I sat there for a long time, the rhythmic pulse of the field echoing in my memory, the whispers seeming to seep through the floorboards of the house itself. My father wasn't just a farmer, he was a keeper, and he had failed in his duties. The entity in the field, the marrow, was hungry. The following days were a descent into a waking nightmare. The growth on the farm, already unnatural, accelerated to a terrifying pace. I watched mesmerized and horrified as a morning glory vine visibly snaked its way up a fence post, its tendrils creeping inches in the span of an hour. The tomatoes in the kitchen garden swelled to the size of softballs overnight, their skins stretched so taut it looked like it might burst. But the most terrifying display was the corn in the marrow field. The stalks didn't just grow, they moved. As I worked, I would catch them out of the corner of my eye, turning their massive heads, their leafy tops angling to face me no matter where I stood. It was a slow, deliberate tracking, the action of a predator. I was no longer just a farmer tending a field. I was a mouse being watched by 1,000 silent green cats. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the rhythmic vibration in the soil became a constant, palpable thrum that I could feel even inside the house. The farm was alive, and it was telling me in no uncertain terms that it was waiting to be fed. The question that screamed in the back of my mind, the one that I was too terrified to even form, was what it ate.
The rational part of my brain, the scientist, was screaming for data. My father's cryptic warning, the impossible biology of the farm, it all pointed to a secret, a method he employed that was now failing. I reasoned that if the farm was a business, there had to be records, financials, purchase orders, something that would explain the inputs and outputs of this unnaturally successful operation. My search for tax documents and bank statements led me not to the small, cluttered office downstairs, but to the storm cellar. It was a place I'd avoided since childhood, a dark, damp space that always smelled of wet earth and spiders. Behind a stack of dusty canning jars and forgotten furniture, I found it. A section of the stone foundation that didn't quite match the rest. The mortar was newer, the stones cleaner. Prying at it with a crowbar from the tool shed, I grunted and strained until a section swung inward with a groan of hidden hinges, revealing a dark, cavernous space beyond. A hidden room. My heart hammered against my ribs. The air that wafted out was thick with the scent of aged paper and decay, and underneath it all, the faint, cloying smell of the marrow. Inside, illuminated by the beam of my flashlight, was a single, heavy oak desk and a chair. On the desk sat a collection of leather-bound books, identical in size and shape, their spines unmarked. They were farm ledgers, dating back generations. The first one I opened was from my great-great-grandfather, Thaddeus Reed, dated 1888. The handwriting was elegant, looping cursive, a stark contrast to the horrifying nature of its contents. At first, the entries seemed normal. Records of bushels per acre, rainfall, market prices for corn and wheat. But then, interspersed with the agricultural data, were other stranger entries. Gave the marrow the sick calf, the one with the lung fever. It was a hard winter, but the ground took it. Expect a good spring planting. My blood ran cold. I flipped through the pages, my initial confusion solidifying into pure, unadulterated terror. The ledgers weren't just about crops. They were a meticulous, horrifying record of the tithe. My ancestors, settling on this unforgiving patch of land, had discovered the entity. They hadn't created it. They had found it, a chthonic, sentient consciousness slumbering in the soil. They learned of its properties, its ability to enrich the surrounding land and grant them impossible harvests. And they learned its price. The early entries were almost entirely about livestock. A prize sow, given to the marrow before the frost. A barren ewe, to ensure the winter wheat. They wrote of it with a kind of fearful reverence, a grim transaction with a demanding subterranean god. They described how the black soil would seem to quicken after a feeding, how the ground would ripple and churn as it consumed their offering. They had made a pact with the earth itself. As I moved from one ledger to the next, tracing the history of my family through the decades, the entries became more sinister, the handwriting more strained. The Great Depression hit, and the entries about livestock became scarcer. Then, a new kind of entry appeared. A vagrant came looking for work, a strong back, but a weak mind. He will serve the spring planting well. The language was coded, oblique, but the meaning was unmistakable. An unmarked grave on the western line. The marrow is quiet now. The corn is taller than I have ever seen it. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. My family, the stoic, hard-working Reeds I had been taught to revere, their prosperity, their survival through drought and depression wasn't due to hard work or divine blessing. It was built on a foundation of ritual sacrifice. They had fed the land with blood. I found my grandfather's ledger, his handwriting tight and controlled. The entries were more frequent. Travelers, drifters, people the world wouldn't miss. He wrote of his guilt, of the whispers he heard at night, of the feeling of being watched by his own fields. He wrote of the symbiotic terror of their arrangement. The marrow provided for them, protected them, made them rich beyond measure. But its hunger was a constant, looming threat. If they failed to feed it, the bounty would cease, and the land would turn on them. Finally, I reached my father's ledger. His script was a barely legible scrawl, a testament to the weight of the secret he carried. The entries were sparse. The world had changed. People didn't just disappear anymore. There were fewer vagrants, more questions. The tithes had become harder to acquire. I read about close calls, about a traveler he turned away because a car had been seen nearby. I saw his growing desperation, his fear that he could no longer pay the price. And then I found the last entry, written just a week before his accident. The hunger is worse than I have ever known. It whispers my name. It knows the debt is due. I slumped against the damp stone wall, the ledger falling from my trembling hands. It all made sense now. The accident with the harvester wasn't an accident. It was a failed feeding, or perhaps a collection attempt. My father, unable to procure a tithe, had become the target. The marrow was starving, and it had turned on its keeper. Now, with him incapacitated, the debt hadn't been erased. It had been transferred.
The whispers I heard weren't just in my head, they were a demand. The heavy, rhythmic thrumming of the earth was the sound of its stomach rumbling. The family secret was out, and I was staring into the ravenous, waiting heart of it. The farm wasn't just hungry, it was hungry for me.
The knowledge from the ledgers changed everything. The world was no longer governed by the laws of physics and biology I held so dear. It was governed by a single, terrifying principle: the marrow must be fed. My father's accident was a symptom of a deeper crisis. He, the keeper of the pact, had failed to pay the tithe. For weeks, the entity in the soil had gone without sustenance, and now its hunger was becoming a palpable force, a malevolent presence that warped the reality of the farm. The unnaturally accelerated growth was not a sign of health, but a symptom of its ravenous state, a frantic expenditure of its last reserves as it sought to lure in new life. The whispers from the soil were no longer soft sighs. They had coalesced into a constant, sibilant chorus, a sound of desperate, gnawing need. The vibrations were stronger, a deep, guttural growl that resonated through the house's foundation, a constant reminder of the starving beast beneath. The horror, once subtle and atmospheric, was becoming terrifyingly direct. The patch of marrow was no longer static. I could swear it was expanding. One morning, I went out to find that the perimeter of the inky black soil had crept a few feet farther into the healthy, brown loam of the surrounding field. It didn't look like it had been tilled or mixed. It looked like a spill, a slow, dark tide of sentience consuming the inert earth around it. The tendrils of black were like veins, pulsing with that same awful rhythmic energy. The entity was growing, spreading its influence. The true terror came that evening. After checking on my father, I walked into the kitchen to find a dark trail marring the linoleum floor. It was a smear of that black, greasy soil, leading from the back door, across the floor, and ending at the base of the staircase that led up to the bedrooms. My blood turned to ice. It had tried to get inside. It wasn't just a stationary patch of land anymore. It was mobile. It was hunting. It had crawled from its field, across the yard, up the porch steps, and under the door, drawn by the life within the house. I frantically cleaned the trail, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the cloth. That night, I barricaded the doors with chairs, a flimsy, pathetic defense against an enemy that was the very ground I stood on. 2 days later, a familiar truck rumbled up the drive. Sheriff Brody. He was a large man, his face a road map of worry lines, his uniform stretched tight over a pont that spoke of too many donuts and too much stress. His family had known the Reeds for generations, and the town had always treated our farm with a mixture of awe and fear. He claimed he was just stopping by to check on Jacob, but his eyes told a different story. They darted from the impossibly green cornfields to the dark windows of the house, his hand resting self-consciously on the butt of his holstered pistol. He didn't want to come inside. We stood on the porch, the air thick with unspoken truths. "Heard about Jacob," Brody said, his voice low. "Terrible thing. That old harvester can be a beast." "He's resting," I said, my voice tight. "The doctors say it'll be a long recovery." Brody nodded, his gaze fixed on me. It was a long, hard look, one that went beyond simple concern. It was an assessment. He was gauging me, trying to see if I understood. "Your father," he began, choosing his words with deliberate care. "He always knew how to keep this land quiet, knew how to keep things in balance." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I hope you learn fast, Evie." It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. In his eyes, I saw not malice, but a deep, abiding fear. The town knew. They didn't know the specifics, the ledgers, the bloody tithes, but they knew something was wrong with the Reed farm. They knew its prosperity was unnatural, and they knew it was conditional. My father had maintained the peace,
the grim balance between the town and the entity in our field. He had kept the hunger sated. Now, that responsibility was mine. Sheriff Brody wasn't there as an officer of the law. He was there as an ambassador from the terrified populace, begging me to take control of the monster in my backyard before its hunger spilled beyond the boundaries of our property. As he drove away, leaving me alone in the humming, vibrant silence, I felt the crushing weight of generations of secrets settle onto my shoulders. The marrow wasn't just my problem anymore. It was a threat to everything and everyone around me, and it was screaming for its next meal. The animals knew. The few chickens my father kept were in a state of constant agitation, refusing to leave their coop. The old dairy cow, Bessie, would stand at the farthest corner of her pasture, her eyes wide with terror, staring at the cornfield as if it were a wall of fire. They could sense the wrongness, the predatory aura that radiated from the marrow. They refused to go anywhere near it. All except one. My father had a farm cat, a sleek black tomcat named Onyx. He had always been a strange, aloof creature, but in the days following my discovery of the ledgers, his behavior became even more peculiar. He seemed mesmerized by the old field. He would sit for hours on the porch railing, his unblinking yellow eyes fixed on the towering stalks of corn, his body perfectly still. I would call to him, but he wouldn't respond, lost in a silent communion that I couldn't comprehend. One afternoon, I was standing by the kitchen window when I saw him descend the porch steps. He walked with a calm, deliberate purpose, his tail held high, not towards the barn where the mice were, but directly towards the marrow field. I felt a surge of cold dread. "Onyx, no!" I yelled, throwing the door open. But he didn't even flinch. He walked calmly, almost regally, to the edge of the corn and, without a moment's hesitation, stepped inside and vanished among the unnaturally green stalks. I waited, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I listened, straining to hear his bell or a meow. There was nothing but the rustling of the leaves and the incessant, hungry whispers from the soil. Then, from the direction of the central patch of marrow, came a single, sickening sound. It was not a cry of pain, but a wet, definitive squelch, a sound of something being instantly, wholly consumed. And then silence. The whispers from the soil, which had become a constant torment, suddenly quieted. The oppressive, vibrating hum that had permeated the farm seemed to recede, replaced by a feeling of satiety. It was a temporary peace, a brief respite, but the source of it made me want to vomit. I stumbled back into the house, my mind reeling from the horror of what I had just witnessed. The marrow had taken its first offering since my father's fall. A small one, but an offering nonetheless. The proof came the next morning. The small vegetable garden near the house, a patch I'd planted myself years ago and which had always struggled in the farm shadow, had exploded with life. The tomato plants were heavy with ripe, blood-red fruit. The lettuce was crisp and vibrant. The struggling zucchini vines had produced a dozen perfect, dark green squashes overnight. It was as if the life force stolen from Onyx had been redirected, mainlined into the surrounding vegetation. As I stood there, staring at the impossible bounty, I felt it. It wasn't a voice or a sound, but a psychic impression, a wave of feeling that washed over me from the land itself. It was a faint, seductive sensation of gratitude, a psychic thank you. In that moment, I was given a horrifying, intimate glimpse into the minds of my ancestors. I felt the allure of the pact,
the intoxicating rush of power that came from commanding life and death, from turning a small sacrifice into impossible prosperity. For a terrifying second, I understood why they had agreed. I understood the temptation of playing God. The experience changed my connection to the entity. The whispers, when they eventually returned, were different. They were no longer just formless, hungry sounds. Now, woven within them, I could hear distorted echoes of voices, faint, ghostly fragments of words and phrases. I heard a man with a thick 19th century accent complain about the cold. I heard a woman humming a lullaby that was popular in the 1930s. I heard my grandfather's distinct gruff tone muttering about the price of wheat. The marrow wasn't just a mouth, it was an archive. It absorbed the memories, the very consciousness of those it consumed. The tithes hadn't just fed it, but they had become part of it. I was living alongside a mass grave, and the ghosts of my family's victims were whispering to me from the dirt. The personal connection was no longer just about a bloodline, it was about listening to the echoes of the blood that had been spilled. The satisfaction from the cats did not last. It was an appetizer for a starving leviathan, a fleeting taste that only served to remind it of its true hunger. Within 2 days, the ravenous presence returned, stronger and more demanding than before. The brief peace was shattered, replaced by an active, aggressive pressure that was no longer content to wait. The marrow was done whispering. It began to scream. The siege on the house began in earnest. I woke one morning to a deep, grinding sound like stone on stone. Rushing downstairs, I found a network of thin, black, root-like tendrils pushing through the mortar of the storm cellar's foundation. They were tendrils of the marrow, questing, probing, actively working their way into the house. They pulsed with that familiar, sickening rhythm, and the air was thick with the smell of damp, hungry earth. All day, I listened to the sounds of the house groaning under the strain. I heard scratching and whispering under the floorboards, no longer confined to the field, but right beneath my feet. The entity was trying to get in, drawn by the two sources of life within, my father, weakened and helpless, and me. The farm itself seemed to be turning on me. The unnaturally tall cornstalks pressed closer to the house, their shadows falling like prison bars across the windows. Vines snaked up the walls, their suckers leaving black, soil-like stains on the white wood. It felt as if the entire field was slowly, inexorably crawling towards the house, a great, green wave of hunger preparing to break over us. The psychological toll was immense. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house was a tendril breaking through a wall. Every rustle of leaves was the marrow creeping closer. I was a prisoner in my own home, besieged by an enemy I couldn't fight with conventional weapons. On the third night of the siege, my father had a moment of startling lucidity. I was changing the cool cloth on his forehead when his eyes shot open, clear and sharp with terror. He grabbed my hand, his grip like a vice. His breath came in ragged, desperate gasps, but he forced the words out, his voice a raw, urgent whisper. "It knows you, your blood, the same blood." He coughed, a racking, painful sound. "It wants a reed. The tide. It's a blood pact." He squeezed my hand so hard I thought the bones would crack. "Don't let it take you." His eyes rolled back for a second, but he fought his way back to consciousness for one final desperate message. His lips formed a single word, a puff of air more than a sound. "Fire." And then he was gone again, collapsing back into the feverish depths, leaving me with his final, terrifying revelation. It wasn't just any life the marrow wanted. It wanted one of us. The pact wasn't with the family. It was with the family's bloodline.
My ancestors hadn't just been keepers, they had been potential sacrifices. All this time, I had thought the danger was being consumed. The true horror was that I was on the menu by birthright. His final word echoed in my mind: fire. It was a clue, a weapon, a desperate last-ditch strategy from a man who knew the enemy better than anyone. As if on cue, a loud crack echoed from downstairs. A section of the floorboards in the living room splintered upwards, pushed from below by a thick, writhing tendril of black, pulsating soil. The marrow was inside the house. I was trapped. My father was helpless. The choice was stark and immediate, stripped of all complexity. I could not reason with it. I could not appease it. The entity was breaking down the door, and it would not stop until it had a read. I had to either sacrifice myself or my father to it, perpetuating the cycle of horror, or I had to find a way to fight back. I had to find a way to destroy it. And my father had given me the key: fire.
My father's word, fire, ignited a desperate hope in the terror-stricken landscape of my mind. It was a primal solution, but my scientific knowledge latched onto it, giving it form and function. The marrow was a biological entity, ancient, powerful, and seemingly supernatural, but at its core, it was a complex organic structure. It lived, it hungered, and perhaps it could burn. I didn't just need a fire, I needed an inferno. I needed to create a blaze so hot and so fast that it could sterilize the very core of the field, incinerating the entity's physical anchor to this world. The plan formed in a frantic rush of adrenaline-fueled clarity. The accelerants in the tool shed, gasoline for the tractor, kerosene for the old lamps, canisters of propane. The unnaturally tall, unnaturally dry corn stalks would be the perfect kindling. I would create a massive fire brick around the house in the marrow field, and then I would set the whole cursed place ablaze. But first, I had to get my father out. This was the gauntlet. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was the monster's hunting ground. As I raced to my father's room, the house groaned and shuddered around me. The whispering was a deafening roar now, a cacophony of a million hungry voices screaming in my mind. In the hallway, a tendril of black soil, thick as a python, slithered from beneath the floorboards, writhing and questing in the air. I leaped over it, my heart seizing in my chest. Getting Jacob out of the bed and into a wheelchair was a Herculean task. He was a dead weight, lost to his fever, and the house seemed to be actively fighting me. The floorboards buckled under my feet, trying to trip me. The very air felt thick and resistant, pushing against me. As I willed him towards the back door, the front door of the house finally gave way with a splintering crash, and a wave of black, churnal soil poured into the foyer like a slow-motion tsunami. We had seconds. I shoved the wheelchair out onto the porch and down the ramp, my muscles screaming in protest. I got him to the old farm truck, hauled him into the passenger seat, and buckled him in, his head lolling against the window. He was safe. For now. My job wasn't done. I ran back, not to the house, but to the shed. I grabbed every can of gasoline and kerosene, my mind a blank slate of pure focus. I worked with a desperate, methodical speed, sloshing a wide circle of accelerant around the marrow field and the besieged house. The fumes were dizzying, but the roar in my head was louder. The black soil was pouring from the house now, pooling at the foundation, its tendrils reaching for me. I backed away towards the truck, the last full can of gasoline in my hand. I created a long fuse line of fuel leading away from the circle. Standing at a safe distance, my breath catching in my throat, I lit a match. For a second, I hesitated. The entire history of my family, the source of our life and our curse,
laid out before me. Then I dropped the match. The world erupted. The fuse line ignited with the whoosh, a river of fire that raced towards the cornfield. The unnaturally dry corn went up in a single explosive instant. A wall of flame roared towards the sky, turning the night into a blistering orange day. The heat was immense, a physical blow that pushed me back against the truck. Then the fire reached the central patch. It reached the marrow. What happened next was beyond sight or sound. The ground itself began to writhe and contort, buckling as if in agony. But the true horror was the scream. It wasn't a sound that entered my ears. It was a psychic shockwave that slammed into my skull. It was the sound of a million voices, the voices from the ledger, the vagrants, the animals, my ancestors, all crying out in a final, unified chorus of unbearable pain. The very air shimmered and cracked with discharged psychic energy. I saw flashes of their lives, their deaths, and their absorption into the entity. I felt their terror, their despair, and then their annihilation. The psychic scream tore through me, ripping at my sanity, and I collapsed to the ground, my hands clamped over my ears, though it did no good. I was listening to the death of a god, and the sound was breaking the world. Dawn broke over a scene of utter devastation. The inferno had consumed itself, leaving behind a smoking, blackened scar on the landscape. The house, encircled by my firebreak, was saved, though its walls were scorched and blistered. But the marrow field, the heart of our family's sin, was a ruin. The ground was a carpet of gray ash and blackened, vitterized soil. The unnatural, oppressive presence that had suffocated this land for centuries was gone. The whispers were silenced. I stood in the cool morning air, breathing freely for the first time since I'd returned. The remaining vegetation on the farm, the patches of grass, the trees in the distance, already seemed to be fading, their impossible, vibrant green receding to a normal, mortal shade. The curse was broken. I didn't wait. I drove my father, still lost in his unconscious state, to a hospital 3 counties over, to a place where the name Reed meant nothing. I told them it was a farming accident, followed by a freak wildfire. They asked few questions. When he was stable, I began the process of dismantling our legacy. I sold the farm to a corporate agricultural developer for a fraction of its former worth. The blackened, sterile field disclosed as an environmental anomaly. I knew the entity, the marrow, was likely not dead. You can't kill the earth itself. But I had destroyed its anchor, its heart. I had burned away its consciousness and driven it deep, deep into the earth to slumber, perhaps for another 100 years, perhaps longer. It was the best I could do. They could never return. We could never return. Months passed. My life found a new, sterile rhythm. My father was moved to a long-term care facility. He was physically recovering, but his mind remained a distant country I could no longer visit. The psychic scream of the marrow had shattered something within him, leaving him placid and empty. The secrets he kept had consumed him in the end. I accepted a research position at a university on the opposite coast, immersing myself in the clean, logical world of data and peer-reviewed studies. I surrounded myself with concrete and steel, as far from the deep, dark soil of the heartland as I could get. I told myself I was safe. The final scene of my old life played out in the pristine quiet of my new laboratory. I was conducting a routine analysis of a soil sample from an agricultural survey in a completely different state, 1,000 miles from the farm. It was mundane work, the kind I now found comforting. I prepared a slide, placed it under the powerful lens of the microscope, and adjusted the focus. I saw what I expected to see. The familiar composition of minerals, clay, sand, and harmless microbes. The predictable, logical world I had rebuilt for myself. And then I saw it. My blood ran cold, a glacial tide of absolute terror. There, amidst the inert particles, was something else. A single, tiny, thread-like organism. It was black as pitch, and as I watched, it pulsed with a faint, rhythmic inner light. It was just one, a single microscopic spore, but it was alive. I recoiled from the microscope as if it were a venomous snake, a gasp catching in my throat. The image was burned onto my retinas. You can burn a field, you can run 1,000 miles, you can hide in a world of science and reason, but you can't sterilize the whole world. You can't kill the soil itself. And it's hungry, and it remembers the taste of blood.